All right, folks, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Chris, and I'm the host for tonight's session, and tonight's session is all about flight physics. Before we go ahead and start with the presentation, just our normal housekeeping activities. For those of you that are on the participant link, you have your chat window over on the left-hand side. Please feel free to go ahead and enter a question into the chat area, or of course you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. For those of you who are on the viewer link, on the left-hand side you have the Q&A button, or you have the Q&A window on the right-hand side. You can go ahead and enter your question in there. I'll be monitoring that through the presentation, and we'll go ahead and get your questions asked. And also, for those of you who are on the viewer side, we do have plenty of room over on the participant side if you want to switch on over and join us interactively. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Charath. Did I butcher it again?
No, it's fine.
Okay. A new instructor with us. Tonight's topic, as I said, is flight physics, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. And thanks a lot for leading tonight's session.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Charath. And let me just go ahead and screen share first so that we can get that going. All right. So you guys should be seeing my screen now. Perfect. So today's session, as Chris mentioned, is all about flight physics. And this is the first of two parts. It's a fairly involved subject, and I think it makes sense to break it up into two parts. So we'll get started with part one today, and then let's see how far we get today, and then we can move into part two on Tuesday next week. All right. So before I get started, just a quick housekeeping thing. So this is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution non-commercial share-alike license, and what I mean by that is my presentation. You guys are free to share it, make derivative works out of it, whatever you want to do, provided you do a few things. The first thing is that you don't share it commercially or don't use it for commercial purposes. In other words, don't make any money out of it. That you attribute it to me, which means that you at least, on your slides, make sure that it's very clear that some of the work was derived from this. And finally, that you share it using a same license. In other words, I give it out for free. I hope that you guys, I want you to give it out for free as well. And then I've got a few images on here that I actually purchased from ASA. For those who know ASA, they're a big publishing house of aviation material. And so those images, unfortunately, can't be reproduced in your derivative works without buying those images from them. And if you guys ever want to, my email address is on the last slide. Feel free to send me an email. I can send you a link to those images. Everything else, obviously, I've taken from the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, which is pretty much the book that we will be using today, as well as I think Private Pilot Study tends to use for most of the sessions in the future as well. All right, so before we get started then, a little bit about me. I'm a Los Angeles or Los Angeles area-based resident, originally from India, commercial pilot and AGI, also working on my CFI. Hopefully in the next, I'm hoping in the next quarter or so I should have my CFI. Been an av geek, huge fan of airplanes, flying, and aviation for as long as I can remember. My dad used to work for Indian Airlines, and growing up, I remember actually going to the airport. In those days, you could actually walk up on the tarmac to the aircraft, and I remember smelling burnt jet fuel, and even to this day, when I actually smell jet fuel, it sort of has a nostalgic memory to me. It's kind of weird, but that's the way it is. In my day job, I'm head of product development for an e-commerce startup. We are in the direct-to-consumer wine business. So if you're a wine connoisseur or you want to buy wine or whatever, shameless plug, just hit me up. We can work something out. I'm a Star Wars and Harry Potter nerd, and as you can tell from this picture, I obviously need to lose some weight. And just for those who don't know what this picture is and why it's there, this is actually me in the cockpit of a Qantas A380. Which I had flown about 2 years ago when I went with my family over on vacation to Australia. And the cool thing was, the flight out of here from Los Angeles was so empty that we picked up a conversation with one of the flight attendants who was also training to be a pilot. And we hit it off so well that when we landed, he was nice enough to wait for everyone to exit the aircraft and took me into the cockpit to sit down there and actually chat with both the pilots for over 10 minutes. And it was an amazing experience. I mean, I can't imagine an aircraft of this size just being piloted by two little side stick controllers. I mean, it's hilarious to think about it. But that's me. That's my little picture. I don't have a whole lot of other aviation pictures, so I figured I'd put this one up. All right, let's now move to what we're going to talk about. So, like I said before, this is a session on flight physics, which, we also sometimes call aerodynamics, but the reality is we're trying to talk about what makes an aircraft fly, what are the forces that typically impact an aircraft in flight, and, what makes the aircraft stable. That's kind of where we want to stop today. And so, the very fact that we are talking about aircraft implies that we need to know about air, which is the atmosphere, its structure, pressure, and density, altitude. We'll talk about how it flies. We'll talk about the theories behind flight, fairly simplistically, but we will talk about that. We'll talk about, basic aerodynamics. What I'm going to do is, I have these three sections. I'll obviously pause a little bit between these sections, but like Chris had mentioned earlier, feel free to ask questions directly using the Q&A tool or through chat. And I know Chris is monitoring those, and he will stop me if I'm basically not answering one of your questions or whatever. All right, so let's get started then with the atmosphere. So what is the atmosphere? And before we answer that, maybe there's a bigger existential question here. And I said I was a Star Wars nerd, so you're going to see a lot of these things, Star Wars stuff popping up, and just bear with me there. So there's this big sentence or statement that Obi-Wan Kenobi said in Episode 4, where he says something like, "The Force is an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, and it binds the galaxy together." And sometimes, rather irreverently, I wonder if he's just talking about air. Because air actually surrounds us and penetrates us, and maybe it doesn't bind the galaxy together, gravity does. But at the end of the day, air is all around us. So let's talk a little bit more about what air does, what the atmosphere is all about. So the atmosphere itself, it's an envelope of air that surrounds the Earth, and it rests upon the surface of the Earth, right? And the atmosphere, or air, is a mixture of gases, predominantly nitrogen and oxygen. The air is about 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, and about 1% all other gases. At least the FAA figured out how to add all of these up together, so it totals 100%, which is pretty cool. Anyways, at the end of the day, air is a fluid. And by that, it means that it's matter, so it has mass, it has weight. It takes the shape of the container that's in. So if you take air and push it into a cylindrical container, the air inside is going to take the shape of that container. Air is a fluid, and I stress this a little bit because if as a pilot you are starting to take your friends up flying and all that, there are friends who have sort of this fear of flying, and the fact that they cannot see the air makes them wonder if they're sort of flying through a vacuum, right? That there's nothing there that's holding the wings up. And the fact is that the wings are being held up by this fluid called air. It's colorless, and it doesn't feel like it has mass, like water, unfortunately. And so we just take it, we take it for granted that boats can float in water. By the same token, why can't an aircraft float on a fluid called air? So that's what air is. It's a mixture of gases. It's a fluid. It flows. It changes shape. It has certain properties that we'll talk about. But the bottom line is it has mass, weight, and an indefinite shape. All right, so continuing on. Because air has a mass, it exerts a force. And because it's a fluid, this force that it exerts is exerted equally in all directions, and that force is also called pressure. I mean, the force isn't called pressure, but the force over a unit area is called pressure. And when you guys are filling up your car tires or anything like that, you generally have you normally fill your cars up for, whatever it is, 32 psi, and the psi is a unit of pressure. It's pounds per square inch, a force per unit area. The same way, force, pressure exerted by the air is exerted as measured in a unit known as the inches of mercury, or in millibars. Um, so what exactly does inches of mercury mean? And let's talk a little bit about that, right? So the earliest sort of measurement of pressure or atmospheric pressure was by this guy called Torricelli, an Italian inventor, who essentially realized that by sticking a capillary within, a fluid, the pressure that's exerted on that fluid by the atmosphere or by the air actually forces the fluid into the capillary to a certain height. And so let's assume that that fluid is mercury, and there's a capillary there. It basically, the mercury is going to rise in the capillary just like a thermometer, but in this case, it's just pressure that's forcing it up there. And what you're going to end up with is a certain height of that column, which is expressed in inches, right? So, and that's where inches of mercury comes from. Now, scientists and the standards organizations love to have standards. I mean, that is in their name. And so the International Standards Organization ended up picking what they called a standard atmosphere. And a standard atmosphere is basically a definition for what ideal air should be at sea level. So at sea level, they basically say that air should be at 15 degrees Celsius with a pressure of 29.92 inches of mercury. That's a standard atmosphere. I've got it in green on my slides because this is something that you need to remember. It is something that sometimes shows up on the private pilot knowledge test, so you might as well know this. The other unit of measure for pressure is something called millibars, or in fact, more commonly in today's world, the ICAO uses something called hectopascals. A hectopascal is in hundreds of pascals, and it's actually the same as a millibar. So the standard unit of pressure for air at sea level is considered to be 1013.2 millibars or hectopascals. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes you might see 1013.2 expressed somewhere. In fact, as we go further into this private pilot study group, you will go through weather reports where the pressure is actually expressed, or detailed pressure is expressed in hectopascals. So it's kind of nice to know that. All right. I haven't been interrupted yet, so I'm assuming we're good to continue, so I'm just going to keep going.
Yep, you're good to go. No questions yet.
All right, let's do this. So just remember, air at sea level, 29.92 inches of mercury, 15 degrees Celsius. All right. So some rules of thumb, right? So we all know this probably instinctively or intuitively, and we know that as we climb higher and higher in altitude, the temperature of the air, or the temperature of the air that surrounds us, goes down, and we also know that the pressure of the air goes down. And air pressure obviously goes down because there's less air above us, and so the higher you go, the less air there is. Therefore, there is less weight on us, or less mass that's impacting us, which means there's less pressure. So these are two rules of thumb that are, again, very common, something that you should memorize. It's not very difficult, so it's easy to memorize. The standard temperature lapse rate is 2 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet in altitude. In other words, let's say that we're at sea level on a standard day, and the temperature is now 15 degrees Celsius. You climb 1,000 feet, the standard atmosphere is expected to be at 13 degrees Celsius, because that's 2 degrees Celsius less. At 5,000 feet, the standard atmosphere air is supposed to be at 5 degrees Celsius. And at 10,000, it becomes -5. So just keep, 2 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet. And the standard pressure lapse rate is 1 inch of mercury for every 1,000 feet. So it's fairly easy, temperature goes up, cold goes down 2 degrees for every 1,000 feet, pressure goes down 1 inch for every 1,000 feet. So once again, if air at sea level is at 29.92 inches of mercury, at 1,000 feet, the air should be exerting a pressure of 28.82 inches of mercury. Just memorize these numbers. You're going to use these. It'll probably be on your test, but even if it isn't, it's very good to have these rules of thumb in your arsenal as you go forward. All right. So we're going to dive into a couple of concepts. I am going to talk about them very briefly today. I suspect we might cover them in a little more detail as we get into aircraft performance. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 sessions down the line. But let's just talk about these today because, in a sense, the next slide, which is called density altitude, is more relevant to our discussion today than this particular slide. So in aircraft performance, or in talking about the atmosphere and air, there is a concept we call pressure altitude. And what that is really the height above a theoretical level called the standard datum plane. There is no standard datum plane in the world. It's not like if you walk around the surface of the Earth, you're going to magically find this thing called a standard datum plane. It's a theoretical level, so it's imaginary, it's theoretical. It was something that someone made up. Now, the standard datum plane is a point on the Earth's surface at which the weight of the atmosphere, or the atmosphere, exerts a pressure of 29.92 inches of mercury. Now, depending on how the atmospheric pressure changes, remember that that could be either above, below, or at sea level, right? So it's very rare that at sea level the conditions are exactly standard. In fact, it's more common that at sea level the conditions are not standard, just because of what's happening in the atmosphere and the air above us, right? So, we often talk about low pressure and high pressure, and depending on how the pressure of the air is around you, on a given day, because of atmospheric conditions or climatic conditions, it is possible that the standard datum plane moves. The easiest way for you to calculate or figure out what your pressure altitude is by setting your altimeter inside the aircraft to 29.92 inches of mercury, or 101.3.2 hectopascals if you choose to do that. The other way is to actually apply a correction factor to the indicated altitude depending on the altimeter setting. We will cover this in pilot math or performance math or whatever that session is called. Just keep this in mind. I don't want to delve into this in too much detail today. The reason pressure altitude is important is because it actually is used as the basis to calculate something called density altitude. And I'm going to talk about this density altitude because it can get a little confusing. So let me talk about it in a little more detail. So the density of air varies with temperature, humidity, and pressure. And by the largest extent, it varies with temperature. So the hotter it is than standard temperature, the air is actually less dense, which means the air is actually thinner. And the colder it is than standard, the air actually becomes more dense, or it becomes thicker or heavier, right? So, yeah, so just keep that in mind again. So air that's hotter than normal is less dense. Air that is colder than normal is more dense. This change to the density of the air impacts how an aircraft performs. Less dense air makes the aircraft perform worse. The power is reduced because the engine is taking in less air, right? Less dense air means that there are lesser molecules per unit volume in the air. And so as the aircraft's flying through the air, the engine's taking in less air. There's less thrust because if you think about it, the propeller is basically trying to, effectively think of the propeller as trying to bite through this fluid called air. And as the propeller is trying to bite into the air, if the air is thinner and thinner, the propeller is actually becoming less efficient. And finally, the lift on the aircraft is reduced because the thin air exerts less force on the airfoil. So why is this important again, right? So as you can see, it's important to know what your density altitude is because that impacts the performance of your aircraft when you're flying. And we're not going to talk about the performance in detail, but we just need to know the density altitude impacts performance. So what is this thing called density altitude then? So I said that as the temperature goes up, the air at a certain altitude becomes thinner than it should be. So, earlier we were talking about the temperature lapse rate, and I said something like air at 5,000 feet should have a temperature of 5 degrees Celsius. Let's say the air at 5,000 feet has a temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. It's kind of common in LA in the summer that we have air temperatures that are really high. So when air is now 15 degrees Celsius hotter than it should be, the air has become less dense. And effectively, the air is now behaving like it was air at a higher altitude. Because remember, the higher you go in altitude, the density of the air comes down, the air becomes thinner. So rather than behaving like air that's at 5,000 feet, air at a higher temperature is now going to behave like air at perhaps, I don't know, 10,000 feet or 8,000 feet or something like that. Which means my aircraft is going to perform way worse at 5,000 feet in hotter air than it did at standard temperature air at 5,000 feet. So essentially, density altitude is nothing more than pressure altitude that's corrected for non-standard temperature. That's a definition they're probably going to ask you in your test. I know I had to answer this when I did my private pilot test, but just something to keep in mind. All right, so no questions, Chris, so far?
Nope, we're looking good.
All right, let's keep going. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of this whole thing about the atmosphere. And so I'm going to now that we figured out what air is all about, the fact that it has a density, it has a, it exerts a certain pressure, and the hotter it gets, the air actually exerts less pressure and is less dense, which affects performance. I mean, we've kind of covered all of this. So let's talk about how an aircraft flies, right? I mean, I don't know. So in those days, it was probably just magic, but whatever it is, right? An aircraft flies a certain way. And an aircraft flies by generating lift. And this is a meme that's been making the rounds on the internet for a while. Comes from a gym meme where there was all these pictures of these really like buff guys, the bulky guys who are lifting weights, and they're making fun of this scrawny little guy, kind of like Screech or whatever his name used to be called on one of those shows a long time ago. Saved by the Bell, that's right. It's the same thing, right? So a gigantic aircraft looking at a small one saying, do you even lift? And sometimes I wonder, right? I mean, I fly a little Cessna. I mean, not a 152 like this one, but a 172. And I wonder, I mean, how does it generate lift? What is this thing and how does this thing fly? And I know a lot of people have this question. I have friends of mine who have expressed severe doubts that an aircraft should even be flying at all. It just feels unnatural to them. So how does an aircraft generate lift? And before we kind of talk about how it flies, let's talk about what makes it fly, right? The main component of an aircraft that makes it fly is this thing called an airfoil. The airfoil is basically a shape that when it moves through a fluid or through air, causes the generation of a force, an upward force that's called lift. So an airfoil, as you can see from this picture here, and I'm from this picture here, basically has this really interesting shape. It's got sort of this sort of elliptical or ellipsoidal shape. And this is the cross-section of a wing, essentially. So it's got this really strange shape. It's sort of bulky in the front, and it sort of tapers off towards the end. And as you can see, the upper surface of this airfoil has a much greater curvature than the lower surface of the airfoil. So there's a few definitions that you're going to need to know. So let's talk about that when we talk about the airfoil. The first definition first of all, before we get into that, the part of the airfoil that's up front, that's sort of bulky looking, that's rounded in its edge, is the part that typically impacts the air, right? That's the part that is facing forward and is basically moving through the air, so the air is impacting it, and that is called the leading edge of the airfoil. And the part that's tapered and at the very back of the airfoil, the very end, which is basically on the right-hand side of this slide, is called the trailing edge. And that's where the air exits out of when it sort of flows over the airfoil and comes out on the other side. The line, an imaginary line that connects the leading edge and the trailing edge of the airfoil, is called the chord line. This is an imaginary line, so if you cut open a wing, you're not going to find a chord line in there. It's imaginary. It helps characterize what the airfoil looks like. The other imaginary line that people typically use when referring to airfoils is called the mean camber line. The camber is really how curved the airfoil is, and the mean camber line is an imaginary line that's equidistant from the top and bottom surfaces of the airfoil. In general, the higher the camber of the aircraft, the more lift it generates, so the higher its coefficient of lift really is what people say. So just keep that in mind. I mean, these two definitions typically come in the test, or at least one of them. The chord line invariably ends up showing up on the test. Or at least your DPE will probably ask you this when you go for your check ride, so just keep that in mind. Now, as the airfoil basically moves through the air, there is a certain direction of motion that it has. In this case, I've got, the airfoil moving horizontally from the right to the left. The wind that hits the airfoil is basically now hitting it it's parallel to the direction of motion, but it is in the opposite direction, right? So if the airfoil is moving from right to left on my slide, the wind that hits the airfoil is effectively flowing from the left to the right, or it's impacting the airfoil from the left to the right. That wind is called the relative wind because it is relative to the direction of motion. And the relative wind is always parallel to and in the opposite direction of the direction of motion of the aircraft. So if the aircraft's climbing, the relative wind's going to come sort of from the top, right? If the aircraft is descending, imagine the relative wind hitting the wing parallel to the direction of motion, but hitting it from the bottom, right? It's kind of climbing. Now the angle that's formed between the chord line and the relative wind is called the angle of attack, typically expressed by the Greek alpha symbol, and it's a very important piece in the generation of lift. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So just remember that the angle of attack is the angle between the chord line and the relative wind. Don't confuse it with the angle of incidence, which is the angle between the axis of the aircraft and the wing itself, or the airfoil itself. And the other thing that people typically confuse themselves with is that the angle of attack is basically, the pitch angle or the deck angle of the aircraft. And what I mean by that is how high the cockpit is when you're trying to climb, for example. And that's not true. The angle of attack is actually just chord line to relative wind. It's important definition that's going to be there, something to note down here. All right. So we talked about how an airfoil, what an airfoil looks like. Now, how does this airfoil generate lift? Now, it's a fairly complex physics problem that, people still get their PhDs and postdoctoral research on this. But the FAA obviously wants you to know to some extent how an airfoil generates lift. And in doing that, they have simplified it down to two basic principles by which an airfoil generates lift. The first one is Bernoulli's principle, and the second is Newton's third law of motion. Bernoulli's principle basically states that as the velocity of a fluid increases, the pressure within the fluid decreases. In other words, the faster you can make a fluid flow through a pipe or something like that, the lower its pressure is going to be. And Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We've heard this all the time. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So just two different principles that will help in the definition or in deciding how lift is actually generated, which we'll look at in a moment. So let's talk about these two theories and how lift is produced by the airfoil. On the right-hand side of the slide, I actually have the picture of an airfoil as it is moving through air. The airfoil is moving from the right to the left, and the air obviously is now the relative wind is moving from the left to the right. So because of the shape of the airfoil, the air flowing over the upper surface of the wing or the airfoil has a higher velocity than that's flowing at the lower surface. In other words, the upper surface air is flowing faster, the lower surface air is flowing slower because of the shape. Because of the shape of the airfoil. What that means, because of Bernoulli's principle, is that the air on the upper surface of the wing has a lower pressure than the air at the lower surface of the wing. And therefore, what Bernoulli tells us is that there is lower pressure on the upper surface of the wing, and because air tends to flow from higher to lower pressure, the airfoil itself, which is suspended in this air, is deflected upwards. The second thing that happens is when this air is flowing over the airfoil and it exits at the trailing edge of the airfoil, it gets deflected downwards through something called downwash, right? And when this downwash basically moves downwards, it imparts, by Newton's third law, there is a downward force that the downwash has that causes a resultant upward force called that basically lifts the airfoil upwards. So these two things combine to basically generate lift. The most common one that the FAA subscribes to that shows up in all the tests is the explanation by Bernoulli's principle that air on the upper surface of the wing has a lower pressure than that on the lower surface, and that causes the wing to be lifted upwards. All right. So we've kind of covered everything we needed to about lift, at least as it pertains to a private pilot syllabus. There's not a whole lot of difference actually between this and the commercial syllabus, but just want to let you guys know. So let's continue into aerodynamics, which, it sounds really big and all of that, but the reality is we're talking about the forces of flight and how they impact flight. So there are four forces of flight. We've already looked at one, which is lift, and that's the upward acting force that opposes the weight of the aircraft. The weight of the aircraft, there's not a whole lot to talk about. It's the physical weight of the aircraft. It's occupants, it's fuel, and everything else, right? So the aircraft, typically has a certain weight. When you put people into it, it has more weight. When you add fuel, it has more weight. All of that together just is called the weight of the aircraft. Important to note that the weight of the aircraft is always presumed to act through a point on the aircraft called the center of gravity. The same way, lift on the aircraft is presumed to act through a point on the airfoil or the wing called the center of pressure or the center of lift. All right, so then the other two forces. So we talked about the vertical forces, the horizontal forces. So we have thrust, which is the force that causes forward motion of the aircraft, typically generated by the engines or the propeller, and this results in airflow over the wings. And then there's drag, which opposes the forward motion of the aircraft. That's a real drag, though. Sorry, I couldn't resist that joke. I had to make it. But the fact is, drag is a rearward force that opposes forward motion of the aircraft. What's important to note is that when the aircraft is actually in level, unaccelerated flight, in other words, it's neither climbing nor descending, neither is it speeding up nor slowing down, the two horizontal forces, so thrust and drag, are equal to each other, and the two vertical forces, lift and weight, are equal to each other. The aircraft is essentially in what's called equilibrium. It's in steady state flight. All right, so continuing on, and I'm going to speed up a little bit because I can tell that I'm starting to run low on time here. So let's speed up a bit.
That's a good point. I was looking at the time saying, okay.
Yeah. All right. Let's go. So what does lift depend on? And I'm talking about lift here mainly because lift really depends on a few factors. The density of air, we talked about this, the surface area of the wing, the velocity and the angle of attack. And the higher the angle of attack, the higher the lift, to a point. So what happens is as the angle of attack starts going up, at some point the airflow over the airfoil starts to become more and more turbulent, as you can tell by the third image from the left here in the slide. So when the airflow becomes more and more turbulent, at some point when the angle of attack of the airfoil exceeds what's called a critical angle of attack, the airflow separates from the upper layer of the aircraft, of the airfoil, and it results in a reduction in lift or a loss of lift. It's actually a reduction in lift. So it's not like the wing has lost complete lift and now down to zero, because if that happens, the aircraft will come plummeting out of the sky. That's not going to happen. There's a small reduction in lift because of that. So remember that a stall occurs at the same critical angle of attack regardless of any other factors, and at this point the airflow is basically separated from the top of the airfoil. Now, the other force that we want to talk about, I mean, we've already talked about weight, it's just weight, and then thrust we'll talk about in another presentation about the propeller and things like that. So let's talk about the other force that impacts an aircraft, that is drag. Drag, as I said, was a rearward acting force, and drag actually has two components to it, or is caused by two factors. There's parasitic drag, which is really drag that's caused by when the aircraft surfaces interfere with the airflow. And then there's induced drag, which is because of airflow circulation around the wings when lift is produced. And so induced drag, essentially, I mean, it's kind of ironic, but induced drag, in a way, is a byproduct of the production of lift itself. Parasitic drag itself has three parts, or three types. There's form drag, which is due to the shape of objects that protrude into the wind. So, you know, a typical sort of general aviation aircraft has all kinds of things that protrude into the wind, right? So we've got, well, we have the wings themselves, obviously, but we need those. But then we also have the landing gear. And in many aircraft, you'll find that the landing gear actually has a fairing on it, something that's very streamlined in shape. And that is to minimize form drag, because the more streamlined the shape is, the less drag those cause. There's interference drag, which occurs when varied currents of air meet and interact. So, for example, there's air flowing over the wings, but there's also air that's sort of flowing over the fuselage. And there are small eddies that get formed when the air that's at the wing root basically meets the air flowing out of the fuselage, causes a little bit of drag. It's called interference drag, air that's interfering with each other. And finally, the skin friction drag, which is due to the roughness of the surface. And, you know, we all know that any surface, no matter how smooth it is, has actually got a certain amount of roughness due to inherent friction, due to molecular level imperfections. And that's what skin friction drag is all about. So I just wanted to, again, reiterate that induced drag is a byproduct of the production of lift. So total drag itself is a sum of parasitic and induced drag. And what all you really need to know, I mean, if you look at this, is two things. At low speeds, induced drag is going to dominate, right? Because really, it's a byproduct of the production of lift, and at high angles of attack, induced drag is actually very, very high. And so, as you can see by the red line here, the lower the airspeed, so if you're going towards the left of the picture, the induced drag is higher. And at low speeds, parasitic drag is very low because there's not much airflow over the airfoil itself. Now, at high speeds, obviously, the situation reverses. So parasitic drag becomes higher, induced drag becomes much lower. And so the total drag curve actually has this interesting parabolic shape where at some point, the total drag on the aircraft is the lowest. And this is the airspeed when you get the best glide range. So if you look at your pilot's operating handbook, many times they will say that, you know, as soon as you have an engine out, they say pitch for best glide. And the best glide is basically, you know, when total drag is the least. Typically, like in my Cessna, I think 182, it's like 79 knots, whatever, right? I mean, there's a certain number in your pilot's operating handbook. So keep that in mind. All right, so we're done with sort of the four forces of flight. We talked about lift, we talked about drag. We know what weight and thrust look like. Let's talk about what makes an aircraft stable, because this is important for us as we sort of study further. I mean, an aircraft is inherently stable, or most of the GA aircraft that we have are inherently stable, because if they weren't, they would be horrible to fly. And before we get into sort of what stability means, there are sort of what I call the three itties, right? There's stability, which is really the tendency of an aircraft to return to equilibrium after it's disturbed. So you push the nose down, and the aircraft has a tendency, as soon as you release the yoke, to try and come back to level flight attitude, things of that nature. There's maneuverability, which basically allows the aircraft to be maneuvered easily and withstand the stresses that result from these maneuvers. and there's controllability, which is the capacity of the aircraft to respond to control inputs. So if an aircraft, can basically do a snap roll as soon as you turn the ailerons, that means the aircraft is more controllable than another aircraft like a Cessna that might take longer to turn. And stability of an aircraft is expressed along three axes. And this is common knowledge, so I'll quickly run through them. There's a pitching axis, which is where the nose and the tail basically go up and down along an axis that's parallel to the wings, and that's called the lateral axis of the aircraft. The pitching moment is controlled by the elevator. So, you pull the yoke towards you, the elevator goes up, it causes the aircraft to pitch up. You push the yoke away from you, the elevator goes down, causes the aircraft to go down, for the nose to go down. There's a rolling moment, which is caused by, which is basically affected by the ailerons in the aircraft. And that rolling moment is around the longitudinal axis, which is an axis, an imaginary axis, a line again, that goes from the nose to the tail of the aircraft. And so the rolling moment is when the wings basically, turn, towards the right or the left, depending on how you rotate the yoke. And finally, there's the yawing moment, which is the motion of the aircraft about an axis called the vertical axis, which effectively, if you think about it, is a line that's starting at the top of the aircraft all the way towards your feet and out of the aircraft at the bottom. And the yawing moment basically is what makes the nose turn left or right when you move the rudder. Now, there's two types of stability that we always worry about. The first one is what's called static stability, which is the initial tendency of an aircraft to come back to equilibrium. In other words, you push on an object, and if it immediately wants to come back to its initial resting place, that is called static stability. Dynamic stability, on the other hand, is the tendency of an object to come back to equilibrium after a period of time. So, you push an object, it kind of wobbles around, and then eventually it comes back to rest. That is what we call dynamic stability. So what are the three types of static stability? There's positive, neutral, and negative. To explain these, if you look at the pictures, you can see what I'm talking about. So let's say you have a glass that's basically upside down. So the wider base of the glass is now on a level surface, and you push the glass a little bit. The glass is probably going to tilt, but it's instantly going to try and come back to be flat against the table or the surface it's resting on. It's not going to fall over, it's not going to tip over. Obviously, if you push it hard enough, it's going to tip over, but its initial tendency is to try and come back to rest. Now, if you lay the glass on its side and try and push it, the glass basically rotates now about an axis, and then it ends up at a point, but it's never going to try and come back to that initial position just because of the way it is. Now that we call neutral static stability, because what it means is the object really isn't coming back to its original position, it's staying in the position in which it was displaced to, or it's staying at the position to which it was displaced. And finally, let's say you've got a glass with a narrow bottom and a really wide top, and you push on that glass, most likely it's going to wobble, but most likely it's going to tip over. And that we call negative static stability. In other words, the object does not even want to come back to equilibrium. It has a tendency to diverge from equilibrium and go to a completely different state. It doesn't even want to try and correct itself, right? And it goes to a state that's unstable. So a combination of these two things. So we can talk about static and dynamic stability. The reality is most aircraft are built to have what we call positive static and positive dynamic stability. In other words, when you disturb them from equilibrium, there is an immediate tendency for them to try and come back to equilibrium. But even if that tendency tends to cause some oscillation in their movement, over time that oscillation gets dampened out. And you can observe this very often in aircraft, especially in GA aircraft, where if you push the yoke forward and release it, the aircraft will oscillate a little bit, so it'll kind of go up and down for a few minutes, and then eventually it comes back to a level flight attitude, same airspeed and all of that. Ignore the fact that it's a complicated looking graph, but it's just saying that. So there are three types of stability, one along each of the axes of the aircraft, right? So there's longitudinal stability, there's lateral stability, and there's directional stability. Longitudinal stability is stability around the pitching of the aircraft and is probably the most important. What that means is when the aircraft's nose is pushed down or up, there's a tendency for the aircraft to come back to a level flight attitude. It's determined primarily by the position of the center of gravity with respect to the center of pressure or the center of lift. And when we talk about this in another session, we will explore this a little further. But for now, just remember this, right? So the center of gravity and its relative position with regard to the center of pressure or the center of lift is what determines this. And what helps in longitudinal stability is this thing we call the horizontal stabilizer. So we've got the wings that generate lift, the horizontal stabilizer that basically aids in longitudinal stability. And the way it does that is by generating a load on the tail or on the empennage of the aircraft, depending on the airflow over its that flows over it. So let's say, for example, an aircraft's in cruise speed. If you look at these pictures on my slide and the topmost picture, so the aircraft's sort of in level flight. It's cruising along merrily. The horizontal stabilizer has a certain load that's generating that's keeping the aircraft level. Now, let's say a gust of wind basically forces the nose of the aircraft upwards. So the speed starts to come down. What automatically happens is that because the airflow over the horizontal stabilizer goes down, it has a tendency to reduce the load that it generates, or it generates less load, which essentially means that because there's less load, the aircraft now is going to try and push the nose back downwards, thereby accelerating and trying to return back to that level, the same speed and a level flight attitude. And the converse is true too. So if you look at how it is at high speed, I mean, if the nose basically gets pushed down, the tail is going to generate a higher force that's trying to pull the aircraft's nose back up. Now rolling, so that's lateral stability, which is around the rolling axis, right? So basically this is when the wings are turned to the right or the left by the ailerons or by a gust of wind. There is a certain stability there in the aircraft too. You'll find that the aircraft tends to try and want to return to a level flight attitude. And it's determined by three design factors, but the one we'll talk about the most or right now is what's called the wing dihedral. And if you look at most aircraft, you probably wondered, especially in low-wing aircraft, the wings are basically not horizontal. They are inclined upwards at a certain angle from the horizontal plane. That angle or that sort of inclination of the wings upwards is called a dihedral. And the reason the dihedral exists is if you know, for example, if you look at this sort of picture on the right-hand side of the slide, let's say that the aircraft's flying along and it essentially gets tilted towards the left by a gust of wind that hits you on the right-hand side, on the below the right wing. The aircraft now is going to have a tendency to want to slip towards the left, especially low-wing aircraft. And when that happens, there's the wing on the left, the descending wing, essentially now has an increased angle of attack because of the dihedral. And so it has slightly increased lift than the ascending wing or the wing on top. And so the increased lift that's there on the descended wing now tends to roll the aircraft back out of that sort of that bank back to a level flight attitude. So again, what you really need to understand is that dihedral helps with lateral stability. That's really the key point I was trying to make. And finally, let's talk about directional stability, which is stability around the yaw axis or the vertical axis. And this is really determined by the tail. So let's assume that we're flying along and a gust of wind hits us from the right-hand side of the aircraft, and it basically tends to turn the nose towards the right? So the tail gets deflected left. The nose is now going to turn right. Because of where the vertical stabilizer or the tail is located, the wind that hits the tail is now coming at a slightly different angle, and that now causes a yawing moment where there's basically a little more force that's generated that basically pushes the tail back towards the right and the nose towards the left, trying to bring the aircraft back into equilibrium. So that's all I have here. I'm going to just wrap up in a couple more slides, but That's all I've got. Uh, we've got a few more minutes, so let me try and wrap this up. So what did we cover so far? We talked about the properties of air. We talked about what a standard atmosphere is. We talked about pressure and density, altitude. We discussed a temperature lapse rate and a pressure lapse rate, so keep those in mind. We talked about how an airfoil produces lift. We talked about the four forces of flight and the types of drag. And we talked about how the aircraft tends to be stable about different axes. So we covered a lot today, and there's a lot more to go. So in part 2, which is on Tuesday, I'll be talking about the forces in maneuvering flight. We talked today just about level flight. So what happens when you're turning? What happens when you're climbing and descending? We talk about propellers, and we talk about stalls, load factor, and a few other miscellaneous items that we want to cover. And finally, just sort of next steps. If you're really interested, please review the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. There's a new version that came out in 2016 that just came out, I think, like a couple of months, maybe a month ago.
Yep.
Yeah, it was about a month.
Mm-hmm.
So please review that. So the chapters 4 and 5 actually are from that book, not the older version. If it's the older edition, I think it's chapters 2 and 3.
Yeah, they changed the chapters around a little bit.
Yeah,
so it's like one-off.
Yep. And then just prepare questions for the next session. We'll attempt to have a short Q&A. And in terms of other things, I mean, this is sort of my shameless plug for myself, right? So visit my website. I've got a website called pfactor.io. We'll talk about what pfactor is actually on the next session that I'm conducting. But pfactor.io is my website. You can subscribe to my mailing list. Or you can go to Facebook and go to my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/pfactor.io. And if you need any further training, my email address is on the last slide. I'll put up these slides on pfactor.io as well for you guys to review. Just give me a few days to do that, but it'll be up there. That's all I had. Chris, you want to wrap it up? Or?
No, that was fantastic. So I guess while we're wrapping things up here, if anybody does have any questions that they want to submit, please feel free to do so now. Very good presentation. There's a lot of information, and in an hour, it's hard to get a lot of the flight physics down. Going through the training, I'll give you a good example, is dihedral, right? Not on the written test will you see much information, about dihedral, not until you get to the commercial level, right? But when I went into my practical exam, my DPE asked me about the dihedral on my Skyhawk. I looked at him and I went, what? If you look at the wings of a Skyhawk, there's a dihedral, and it's different on each wing. Your wings are not equal on both sides on a Skyhawk. We can talk about why later. It has to do with some of the stuff that we're going to cover on Tuesday.
That's right.
No, fantastic presentation. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat box, so I'll take that as a good thing. And for those of you who are going to join us on Tuesday, if you do have any questions, review the session again. It's always available in our archives. If you have any questions, bring them to the next session, and we'll go ahead and try and have a short Q&A at the opening. So with that, we'll go ahead and end a couple minutes early here. We do have one comment here, and I just want to make sure. Troy says, except horizontal. Yeah, I know he'll cover that in the next session. So that'll be in the next session. A lot of information about the propellers and some more forces on that. So, all right. Well, we'll go ahead and shut it down early tonight. Thank you very much for leading the session. It was fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and I'll see everyone on Tuesday, okay?
All right. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.